Welcome into the Locked On LSU podcast. It is Wednesday, February 2nd, and last night was a tough night for the Tigers on the hardwood, falling 76-72 to Ole Miss in the PMAC. What is going on with this team, and why do they always seem to make it much more difficult on themselves than it needs to be? We'll look into that. And also, it is National Signing Day. What pieces does Brian Kelly still have left to bring into this team? And what are some big names to look for on this National Signing Day? Players that could potentially end up in the purple and gold in the 2022 season. We'll get into all of that coming up on the Locked On LSU podcast.
You are Locked On LSU, your daily podcast on the LSU Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Thanks for making the Locked On LSU podcast your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms, so make sure to check us out. We'll be dropping every weekday morning. I am not Matt Moscona, as you've probably noticed by now. My name is Caroline Fenton, and I am your new Locked On LSU podcast host. I'm so incredibly excited to be here. I am an LSU alum. I am a diehard LSU fan. I covered LSU sports, everything from LSU football, basketball, baseball, softball, women's basketball, you name it. I covered it in my tenure as an LSU student from 2015 to 2019, all for student media, for WAFB as well. And then also I covered LSU and college football as a whole, my time at ESPN in Bristol, Connecticut. But now I am currently a radio host in Nashville, Tennessee for ESPN 1025 The Game, where I cover the NFL, the NHL, college football, and our local teams here in the Tennessee Titans, the Nashville Predators, the Vanderbilt Commodores, Tennessee Volunteers, and anything and everything and the biggest stories in sports. But I'm so incredibly excited to have this platform to talk about my absolute favorite team in the world, and that is LSU. I'm a diehard LSU fan, and I know that you all listening are as well. And I'm excited to get into this. I'm excited to dive into LSU stories every single day. I'm going to be tough on the team. I'm going to give my opinions, and I'm going to tell it like it is. But I'm really excited, and it all comes out of love for this team. So I'm pumped to get started. And thank you for listening. Thanks for coming on this journey with me, because I am absolutely pumped to get started. But last night, not a good night for LSU on the hardwood. And it's like the same thing, but a different day for this team. Because it seems like every game that the Tigers seem to drop, it's because they can't seem to get things moving offensively, or they just can't get started until the second half. And for LSU last night, both of those things were the case. It was almost like a tale of two teams in this game last night. Now we got the good and the bad. And I think the storyline here is the bad. So I'll go ahead and start with the good, because I think that the good deserves a little bit of credit. Darius Days had himself a day last night. He seems to be game in and game out the catalyst that this team needs offensively. Because when they couldn't get things moving in the first half, Darius Days starts off the second half with 2 threes, had 21 total points on the night, 14 of those coming in the second half, and also adding 13 rebounds onto that as well. Darius Days had himself a night and was kind of leading this comeback kid mentality for the Tigers last night. But I say comeback kids because they had an absolutely atrocious first half. So Ole Miss entered this game shooting not even 43% from the field. Some of the bottom feeders of the SEC, they were in the lower half of the SEC in terms of shooting percentage from the field. But in the first half, Ole Miss shot 65% from three, which shows two very bad things. Just shows that LSU's defense, which has really been the backbone of this team all season, just was not there in the first half. But it's not like this is coming from some sort of elite offense. LSU let an average to below average offensive team just run all over them in the first half. And LSU, I call them the comeback kids, because that's what they've been able to show game in and game out, is they can dig themselves in a hole and they can get out of it. But I said in the beginning of the show, this team always makes it more difficult on themselves than it needs to be. And that's exactly what they did last night, and letting Ole Miss run away with the game in the first half. Deshaun Ruffin, first of all, bad dude, but also walked all over this LSU defense in the first half, had 19 points on the night, didn't even play a full game. He left in the middle of the second half with an apparent knee injury, had an MRI last night, so we'll get some more updates on that injury. But 19 points, led the Rebels in scoring last night, and didn't even play a full game. If that just goes to show you how dominant that team looked in the first half. But they scratched and clawed their way back in the second half. Down 20, as soon as they seemed to get themselves back in the game, got some momentum moving. They were down 43-19 in the first half, went on a 13-2 tear, were able to get themselves within a single-digit deficit. Looked like they could make a comeback, but they just continued to look stagnant offensively, continued to commit fouls. And that's the bad part of this. The good part was a Darius Days comeback, was just an electric comeback from Darius Days. And it wasn't just Darius Days. It was a team effort. But whenever you dig yourself in a first half hole, it's really difficult to get out of it. And I think that could potentially be this team's demise this season, is just not getting going until it's too late. Because this team has got some talent now. And this team can scratch and claw their way back, going on a 13-2 tear whenever they're down 43-19. But they never led last night. They're never able to scratch and claw. I say never. Last night, they weren't able to scratch and claw their way back into a victory. And I think that's where you can really kind of praise LSU for saying, hey, if they can't get it done in the first half, they can at least come back in a big way. But I think this stat kind of tells it. LSU shot 8 free throws on the night to Ole Miss's 23. I mean, that's your point differential there, and then some. Not shooting free throws, not getting the ball to fall, I think will ultimately be LSU's demise, if there is one. The biggest things that this LSU team needs to figure out: get going in the first half. Take advantage of your times of possession. Because last night against Ole Miss, it just did not seem like the ball was able to fall. Now, coming up next, we'll do a quick transition into LSU football. It is National Signing Day. What are some of the guys that LSU is looking at? Who could we potentially expect to wear a purple and gold uniform next year? We'll get into that coming up next. But Built Bar, it is the new year. So that means New Year's resolutions. If yours is about getting fit, eating healthier, make sure that you include Built Bar in your plan. Built Bar is a protein bar that tastes like a candy bar, maybe even better than a candy bar, because that doesn't necessarily sound like the rest of the protein bars out there. You eat healthy, but it gets so boring. Like week 3, you might be thinking this is not worth it. But Built Bar makes it easy to stick to your resolution. It tastes so good, you'll want to eat it. Unlike other protein bars, they're chalky, they're waxy, or they taste like a chemical spill. Well, Built Bars are covered in 100% real chocolate. Most Built Bars contain only 130 calories, only 4 grams of sugar, only 4 net carbs, and 17 grams of protein. Compare that to a candy bar, which usually has around 240 calories, 30 grams of sugar, dozens of net carbs. You don't have to give up taste to eat healthy. Here's an idea for the new year. Go to all of your secret treat stashes, at home, in the pantry, at the office, in the car, wherever. Throw out all the sugary or calorie-filled treats and replace them with Built Bars. So when you're craving a snack or a treat, you can reach for something that's healthy and tastes incredible. Even if you're not a huge fan of working out, you can at least eat something that tastes good and is good for you. That way, when you enjoy a delicious Built Bar, you can almost count it as a workout. So there's many flavors to choose from: coconut almond, my personal favorite, peanut butter brownie, raspberry, cookies and cream, salted caramel, mint brownie, and many, many more. In fact, Built Bar is always coming out with new limited time flavors, so make sure to check out built.com often to see what's new. Here's your offer. Go to built.com, use promo code LOCKED15 and get 15% off your order. Use promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. I said we were gonna get into some LSU recruiting, and that we will. It is National Signing Day, so we will keep a lookout for the big names that could potentially make their way to Baton Rouge for the 2022 season. But before we do that, I want to let you all know that every Wednesday, I want to make this a Mailbag Wednesday segment. So feel free to send any questions that you may have, whether that's LSU football recruiting related, whether that's LSU basketball related, LSU baseball preseason. If it's about me personally, if you have any questions that you want answered on the podcast, make sure to send those in to me, and I'll get to those every Mailbag Wednesday. You can follow me at Caroline Fenton1 on Twitter. You can send your questions in there, DM me, tweet me. You can send them to the Locked On LSU Twitter account. Make sure to give that a follow as well for any podcast updates, any podcast drops. Make sure to follow that account on Twitter as well. So get your questions in for next Wednesday, for next Wednesday's edition of Mailbag Wednesday. But today is the official National Signing Day. Who is on LSU's radar that LSU fans should keep an eye out for? Now, we had an early signing period in December. February used to be the big dates, but now with the early signing period coming out, that's really where you get a brunt of your recruits to sign. LSU already has 24 commits, 7 of those from the ESPN 300. LSU currently sitting at 19 in recruiting rankings. But if you consider the circumstances of what went on in the offseason, what went on with the transfer portal, it's not a bad place to sit. And it feels like it is as an LSU fan when you're so used to sitting in the top 5, at least the top 10. But today could be the difference between a top 20 recruiting class and a top 15 recruiting class. And that sounds like you're kind of splitting hairs there. But when you're playing the top 10, top 5 recruiting classes in the nation, you look at Florida, Alabama, Texas A&M on LSU schedule consistently, splitting hairs makes the difference. But we've got 5 names to keep an eye out for National Signing Day today. 5-star linebacker Harold Perkins out of Cypress, Texas, the top linebacker in this year's class. He had an unofficial to LSU last summer, then committed to Texas A&M earlier last month, decommitted from A&M on January 24th, and just 4 days later took his official visit to LSU. This is a huge deal for a few reasons. Why is this important? Top linebacker in the class, 5-star recruit. Number one, LSU lost their best linebacker, Damon Clark, to the NFL draft this past year. Now, LSU has some depth at the position, in the absence of Damon Clark, with Micah Baskerville, Mike Jones Jr., who transferred from Clemson this past summer, got a good bit of playing time this past season, and definitely looks like he's going to be a marquee part of this LSU defense moving forward. So you still have depth at that linebacker position, but losing Damon Clark is really going to take a hit. And you need pass rush in this league. Signing Harold Perkins is going to be huge because he's a player that can really start making moves now. He's not a guy that you bring in as a depth piece. He's not a guy that you sit on the bench, that you start to develop. And maybe once he gets in, they might see that that's what they need to see from him. But Harold Perkins is a player that you can start to see development from now, and that you can start to see production from now. Now, linebacker depth is the first reason why it's important. Second reason why it's important that LSU lands Harold Perkins. If you don't get him, you got to play him. If it's not LSU, it's likely Texas A&M. Florida is also another possibility. And that scares me. As much as I'm endorsing Harold Perkins as a pickup for LSU, that's going to be incredibly terrifying to face next year if he's wearing an Aggie or Gator uniform. So that's one name to keep an eye on. Harold Perkins out of Cypress, Texas. Another one that's incredibly important, 4-star running back Trevante Citizen out of Lake Charles. He's been a massive battle between LSU and Florida. So Citizen was originally committed to LSU, decommitted after the 2021 season, which I can't really blame him there with all of the uncertainty, all of the up in the airedness surrounding LSU football. Can't really blame him there for decommitting, but has still maintained interest within LSU, but also with Florida as well. Billy Napier has been pushing hard for Trevante Citizen, for the Louisiana native. And let's not underestimate the ties that Billy Napier has in the state of Louisiana, coaching Louisiana Lafayette for the past few years. he still maintains very strong Louisiana recruiting ties. So I would not underestimate Billy Napier and his ability to be able to swing some recruits from Louisiana, from LSU to Florida. Auburn and Miami are also in his Final Four, but it seems as if LSU and Florida really are the top contenders. But it's a really important add that can add some depth to this running back position as well. Another one who could argue may be the most important recruit to keep an eye out for in this National Signing Day is four-star safety Jacoby Matthews from Ponchatoula. A one-time LSU commit. LSU is the overwhelming favorite to land him. Florida is also an option for Jacoby Matthews as well. The 6'2", 193-pound safety, big-bodied safety, also doubled as a dual-threat quarterback in high school. Is pretty impressive as well. But would be a huge add for this LSU defensive backfield. Losing Derek Stingley to the NFL draft, losing Eli Ricks to the transfer portal. It's going to be incredibly important to continue to build up this defensive backfield for LSU. And Jacoby Matthews is also another player that can come in and start making contributions to this team immediately. Four-star safety out of Ponchatoula, Jacoby Matthews is another recruit to keep an eye on today. Another one, three-star tight end Danny Lewis out of New Iberia. Now, that name might be familiar to you if you saw that viral video of him dancing with Brian Kelly in the locker room, one that got 8 million views on Twitter and just elicited even more Brian Kelly shade on social media. Name probably sounds familiar to you. He made his LSU visit just a couple weeks ago. Florida, Alabama are also in his likely candidates, but LSU remains in his top 3. So he played tight end and receiver in high school in New Iberia. Adds more depth to this path to the LSU pass catchers to go along with Keishawn Butte, who makes his return after being out with injury in the second half of 2021. Malik Neighbors as well, and of course Jack Besh, who lit it up at the tight end position in 2021. Now, Danny Lewis doesn't necessarily have the same credentials as these 5-stars, these 4-star recruits that are also on LSU's radar, but he could make a big contribution. Why is that? Brian Kelly loves him some tight ends. We love to call LSU DBU, which is another reason why I feel pretty confident that Jacoby Matthews, the 4-star safety out of Ponchatoula, will make his way into Baton Rouge. If there's a tight end, it was Notre Dame. And when you look at some of the huge names that came out of Notre Dame under Brian Kelly's tenure, look at Tyler Eifert, who was a first-round pick in 2013. You look at Kyle Rudolph, both in the NFL. Kyle Rudolph, a second-round pick. And you also look at most recently Tommy Trendle, who was a third-round pick in the 2021 draft. Brian Kelly has produced some really strong tight ends. So to bring in more tight ends, of course, Jack Besh, who is going to lead the way in this tight end position, to bring in more tight ends as depth pieces and also developmental pieces under Brian Kelly, who's been able to develop tight ends, as he's shown in the past at Notre Dame, I think is going to be really key for this LSU offense just to add more pass-catching weapons for Miles Brennan coming in at quarterback in 2022. Another name to look at, 3-star wide receiver Caleb Douglas coming out of Missouri City, Texas. He's considering Florida in addition to LSU. Now, his commitment date has yet to be announced, so he may make his decision tomorrow. He may not. He's not necessarily up there with my top 4 that I just listed. And the 3-star tight end, Danny Lewis out of New Iberia, the 4-star safety, Jacoby Matthews from Ponchatoula, 4-star running back, Trevante Citizen from Lake Charles, and of course, 5-star linebacker, Harold Perkins out of Cypress, Texas. However, Caleb Douglas could also be a really key piece for this LSU offense moving forward. But why does all of that matter? I mean, of course, it's your signing class, it's your recruiting class. But what is so important about that this year? They're important every year, of course. But I'll get into coming up next exactly what is so key about this recruiting class this year moving forward. But before we get into that, I want to tell you about BetOnline. BetOnline has got you covered this season with more props, more odds, and more lines than ever before as football continues its march through the playoffs right to the big game in a couple weeks. BetOnline.net remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. And it's not just football. Football's not your thing. BetOnline also has up-to-the-minute info on pro and college hoops, NHL, boxing, UFC, along with live real-time updates of current games. So if you want to throw some live bets in there, you can do that on betonline.net as well. So don't wait to take advantage of the new and amazing offers available for the 2022 season. Bet online, where the game starts. Locked on LSU. Again, I am Caroline Fenton, making my debut on the Locked on LSU podcast. I'm super excited to be here with y'all every day. Thank you for making the Locked on LSU podcast your first listen every day. We went over the LSU basketball last night to Ole Miss. Just a lackluster first half from LSU. They weren't able to quite dig themselves out of a hole in the first half, but also looked into some of the key names that LSU is going to be looking at today, some names to monitor, their commitments on this National Signing Day. The number one linebacker prospect making his decision today. So make sure to keep an eye out on Harold Perkins and company, who may be committing to LSU today. But why is all of that important? I mean, we make a big deal of National Signing Day every year, of course, because those are going to be the guys that are going to come in. And those are going to be the guys that are going to start making changes to your team. And that's the future of your team, because you recruit for the future. We all know that. We understand why recruiting is important. Now, there's a couple of reasons for this class. First and foremost, it's something that's been important, and it's something that it's been a goal of for LSU's past 4 coaches. I mean, you look at Nick Saban instituting that Boys from the Boot initiative. It's important to keep Louisiana players in Louisiana. LSU is Louisiana. LSU has the privilege of being the most beloved flagship university of any state in the country. And if you look at other teams around the SEC, LSU doesn't have to compete for in-state recruits. Auburn has to compete with Alabama, and Mississippi State has to compete with Ole Miss. Florida has to compete with Florida State, South Carolina with Clemson, so on and so forth. LSU is the flagship university of Louisiana, and there really isn't any close competition. So keeping those players in state is so key, but that's not new. Because you look at these 4 and 5 star players coming out of Louisiana, keeping them in state isn't new. But you look at a lot of in-state players who have turned to Florida, who have turned to Alabama, Texas A&M, they're going elsewhere. So that's, of course, key. If you look at all of these players coming out of Louisiana who will make their commitments today, a 4-star running back, a position of need for LSU, out of Lake Charles. A 4-star safety, a need for LSU, defensive backfield depth, out of Ponchatoula. A tight end, something is also a position of need for LSU coming out of New Iberia. Whenever you can keep your talent in state, it just makes your recruiting so much easier. But again, that's not new. Establishing a presence, a recruiting presence in Texas, Florida, and Alabama is important. Maintaining that recruiting presence is important. But that's also nothing new. That's something that has been a priority for Nick Saban, Les Miles, Ed Orgeron, and I'm sure it maintains a priority for Brian Kelly as well. But I think that's the most key aspect here, is Brian Kelly's first recruiting class. Whenever Brian Kelly was first hired for LSU football's head coach, what was the immediate conversation? It's not a culture fit. He's never recruited in the South. He's a guy from Boston who made his rounds around the Midwest and the Northeast and has probably never even stepped in the state of Louisiana in his life. That's what the conversation was, because Brian Kelly won't fit in at LSU. And if you're not watching on YouTube, you can see me doing air quotes. This recruiting class is so incredibly important for Brian Kelly to establish that he can do it at LSU, that he can recruit in the South, that he can recruit within Louisiana, and that is a priority of his. If you've seen some of the hires that he's made in the offseason in terms of recruiting coordinators, they are all big presences in Louisiana. And all of that can just be smoke and mirrors, or, we could just come off as a good decision from Brian Kelly, unless he can keep these big names and these big time recruits within the state of Louisiana. That's why it's so important. It's a statement from Brian Kelly. It's a microcosm, if you will, for what's to come from Brian Kelly. You make a splash immediately. You keep players in state within your first year. You're able to flip recruits from Florida, A&M, Alabama. You're able to get those recruits back who may have originally decommitted from LSU because they were unsure of the future, and they see what Brian Kelly is building, and he says, no, I want to be a part of this. That's why National Signing Day is different than it normally is, because the in-state priorities remain the same, and flipping recruits from your rivals remain the same, but it's different this year because it's Brian Kelly's statement year. And Orgeron didn't necessarily need to prove to LSU fans that he could recruit. I mean, he did that before. He did that at Miami. He did that at LSU. He didn't necessarily need to prove that he was a culture fit at LSU, and I feel like that needs no more explanation. But Brian Kelly has something to prove, and he has something to prove to the state of Louisiana. And it doesn't just start today, but it continues today. And today is an incredibly important part of that. Thanks for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. Now, tomorrow, I will break down all of LSU's commits, how they fit in, any commits that LSU may have missed out on, and taking a look at the rest of the SEC as well. We'll do that tomorrow on Locked On LSU. Now, make your second listen Locked On Bets, your daily one-stop shop for all your gambling needs. Locked On Bets, hosted by your boy Q, with expert analysis and insight from Lee Sterling. It is free and available on all platforms. That's going to do it for me today. Again, I am Caroline Fenton, and I am so incredibly excited and honored to be the new Locked On LSU host. We'll see y'all tomorrow.